We're delighted that you've joined us this evening for what we know will be a very terrific presentation, and we're especially glad to see so many students. It's my honor to introduce someone who wants to give you a warm welcome to Baylor. He is the Dean of the George W. Truett Theological Seminary and the interim president of Baylor University, Dr. David Garland. Please welcome him.
I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight. I am writing a commentary on the Gospel of Luke, or at least I was some time ago. And this issue is central in the Gospel of Luke. The first thing that Jesus says publicly is, "The Spirit has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." It's the gospel that has beatitudes, blessed are the poor, but also woes to the rich. When John the Baptist sends disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you he who is to come, or should we expect another?" Jesus says, "Well, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them." It's not the miracles and the dead being raised that is climactic, but the poor having good news preached to them. It is also the gospel that has unique parables. The parable of the rich fool, although it doesn't begin, there was a certain rich fool. It begins, there was a certain rich man. There's a parable of the great banquet where the beautiful people have more important things to do. And so the banquet hall is filled with those who are the outcasts and those on the margins. It is a parable, they have the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the only parable where a named character is. And when rich man is in hell, he looks up and sees him. He recognizes him. He cries out to Father Abraham to have him come and relieve his torment and his misery. And what is clear is that he recognizes who he is, he knows his name, and he knows his address. It was the same as his. And so for Baylor University, which believes in faith and learning, to have a conference dealing with the issues of poverty, there could be no more important thing that we do. And I appreciate all of you participating in this and welcome you here to Baylor University. The topics that are being covered are absolutely fascinating, and I am hopeful and prayerful that this will make an enormous impact on our world, and I want to thank all of you and welcome you.
Good evening. My name is Douglas Henry, and both as Associate Professor of Philosophy at Baylor and as former Director of the Institute for Faith and Learning, I want to add my welcome to others that you already have received. Even more so, it is a privilege for me to have the distinction of introducing you to our keynote speaker for this evening. The Reverend Caesar Molebatsi has lived what, for most of us, can only be described as an extraordinary life, touched by extraordinary grace. Under the often brutal and always oppressive conditions of South African apartheid, Caesar embodied a discerning yet unyielding commitment to form Christian justice in ways that world had not seen, and truth be known, that not everyone was prepared to embrace. Indeed, even his own brother George, with ample provocation, chose the violent option to strike back against apartheid and was imprisoned on the infamous Robben Island off the coast of Cape Town, where more than 3,000 political prisoners were once incarcerated, Nelson Mandela among them. Taking a different course from his brother, Caesar no less fought against the oppressive ways of the white government in South Africa and its apartheid laws, but he worked fervently and with tremendous fortitude for change through the grace of God. Faithful witness to the peace to which Christ calls us has marked his ministry and his life's work, and I commend to you David Virtue's fine biography of him, A Flame for Justice. Caesar founded and pastored Ebenezer Evangelical Church in Dobsonville, Soweto, for 2.5 decades, and he has continued to serve the church as pastor emeritus. In recent years, he has turned his attention to the ways in which South Africans and others might move even further in the direction of a more just political and economic order. Those commitments have brought him leadership roles in a number of key development and business organizations in South Africa, including Empowa Consulting, which works to transform organizations to reflect the full dignity and worth of the human person and just arrangements of opportunities, goods, and resources. And also Empowa Investments, which directly shapes business practice in the foods, infrastructure, and mining sectors. Reverend Molebatsi has become a familiar personality through television and radio media, including the Peace Radio program, The Full Story, Two-Way, a popular television audience participation show reflecting and encouraging the pulse of South Africa, and Search for Common Ground, a television series committed to precisely what its title indicates. Known around the world for his inspiring, insightful, and poignantly honest appraisals of the human condition at its worst and at its best in these trying days at the end of modernity, Caesar especially rallies around occasions to address the topics of transformation, justice and reconciliation, human rights, social and ethical accountability, empowerment, and African Renaissance. In the kind of work he continues with the Accountability Institute of South Africa, which develops and implements social and ethical accountability frameworks in the South African context, we all can find good counsel and welcome encouragement. In the caliber of international leadership he has offered as president of the World Alliance of YMCAs, we can find hope for the spread of his transformative and zealous Christian convictions. Reverend Molebatsi is, he wanted me to make sure and say, the husband of 1 wife and 4 fine sons, and he expects his first grandson, by God's grace, in February. This evening, we are privileged to hear him address the topic, Combating Global Poverty Through Entrepreneurship. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Caesar Molebatsi.
Sanbonani. I was tempted to run away after that introduction tonight. Reminds me of the boy who looked at his mom and says, "Mom, we've got to be at the wrong funeral. They cannot be talking about my father." It's been a long journey to come here and to be with you tonight, and I'm most thankful to God for the opportunity. There was a persistence on the part of Darren here for me to come to this evening occasion, and I must tell you, it took quite a while for us to accept. In the office where we work, I've got an accountability group that looks at whether I should do things or not do things, because they know that I don't know my measure. So they try very hard to protect me from myself, because I find it easier to say yes than to say no. But so after quite a while, they did say, "You better consider this one." And I had no idea how you got my name until about 3 o'clock this morning, when I was driving from Dallas-Fort Worth to the hotel. And so I will pay back what Joel Carpenter has done. But God bless him. I'm still a pastor of the Ebenezer Evangelical Church. We now have 4 congregations. We work primarily among the poor. I'm also the director of Youth Life Development Foundation, which is intended to try and raise resources for worthy ministries and activities among the formerly disadvantaged communities of Southern Africa. I attended a college in this country which was very, very Baptistic. And of course, I grew up in a very strong non-Christian background in the 50s and 60s until I became a believer. So when I got to this Baptist college, I found it very difficult to relate to being a Baptist. And so there was a chorus we used to sing. You forgive my gruff voice, but we used to sing, once I was a Baptist, but Jesus set me free. But they used to ask us, well, it's not necessary for you to be a Baptist to go to heaven, but why do you want to take a chance? But I learned the 3-point system of alliteration that is very Baptistic, and sub-points and all the rest of it. But it is really good to be here. I had to convince my wife that the tornado season is over, because one of my young sons was saying, Dad, why are you going to this place where there are these very violent, I don't know why they call tornadoes in this part of the world, mostly call them with women names. And so, why do you go to a place where there's so many violent women, But I'm glad that the last greatest tornado here was 1953. I also learned at 3 o'clock this morning when I wanted to make sure that I can reassure my wife that there will be no great tornado. It truly is a beautiful place, this Waco. And I'm very thankful to know that most of the things that you're known for happen 20 miles away from here and not in this beautiful town itself. So we're very grateful for that. I must also confess, as you probably know, that confession is good for the soul. Maybe not so good for the reputation, but anyway, that I really was stymied when I got onto this campus, and particularly listening and realizing who's here, that Caesar, how can you actually want to stand up after a meal like this and talk about poverty to people such as these? What are you actually going to say? And so I thought maybe I should tell you that I speak out of a personal context. And my context is very, very personal indeed. I was asked one day, well, how long does it take you to prepare a sermon? And I remembered one of my mentors who was actually buried just this past Monday in Colorado Springs, who said to me, well, it takes as many years of your life to prepare a single sermon. So I'll be 59 very soon. So what I'm going to say now comes out of all those 59 years that I have lived. But I've also been caught in the quagmire of being trivocational, where my first love, of course, had to do with spiritual transformation. I preached my first sermon 2 weeks after I became a believer in 1967, and I appreciate that some of you were not there then, but I really love preaching. That's what I've realized is what God has called me to do. Only thing I've learned in latter years of my life is that the preaching does not always have to be verbal. See, I always thought that the word of God must be through proclamation. And I realized that there are other ways of actually exemplifying the love of God and demonstrating that love, that redemptive love of God, through other ways other than proclamation. So sometimes you preach by keeping quiet. But this is my passion, and I love preaching, and it's a wonderful call. And I just don't know why everybody's not a preacher, but anyway, I'll forgive them. But I've been all my life working in terms of direct spiritual transformation, working to find an opportunity to guide men and women, young people and old people, to the personal knowledge of Jesus Christ, and trying to promote the importance and the centrality of Scripture in any believer's life. But I've also been caught recently in what I call social entrepreneurship. And hopefully when I finish, you'll get a little bit of what I mean by this. I will not spend as much time in defining that particular aspect of my life through the presentation tonight. but something of what has led us to do the Accountability Institute in South Africa, which basically sought to inform business in such a way that they could begin to understand that the bottom line is not just about the financial statements. As a matter of fact, for those of you who are in NGOs or not-for-profit, I often ask people, you can judge a good business by the bottom line and by the financial results of that particular business. But how do you actually judge an NGO? Now, unfortunately, and again, this is me now more than what I've written down, is that a lot of people in the West have actually supported wrong things because you've been dependent on good financial reports from your projects. And yet, in reality, a good NGO is not the one that will necessarily produce good financial reports, but one that can trace and have an audit trail of their social impact that you could, at the end of a particular period of time, which should not be 5 years, which is another fallacy that I find, that how come you wait for 5 years before you do an impact study? Whereas any business that would wait for 5 years to do an impact study would be bankrupt in no time, because every year you have to have an audited statement of your results. And therefore you have to have an auditable and independently verifiable set of accounts to give an account of the social impact of your economic activity. So apart from that, and apart from a financial statement, we added then the third dimension, which is the issue of environmental responsibility, talking specifically about our stewardship as co-creators with God in his redemptive purpose. And so we started this Accountability Institute to promote the notion of the triple bottom line. Now, a lot of multinationals fall flat, particularly in Africa, when we begin to look at them in relation to the triple bottom line, because that exposes them to the lack of responsibility that has led to the sort of global warming that we are now experiencing around the world. But the third aspect of myself, out of which I'll be speaking, is the whole area of economic empowerment. Now, I understand, and please, if I do step on some toes, thank God that I only have one leg. I have an artificial leg, so if I step on your toe, it won't be too painful because you won't have the full might of 2 legs. You'll only have one. So if I step on you in this regard, and I talk about economic empowerment in particular because a lot of the things that we do as Christians tends not to want to deal with economic empowerment, but tends to want to talk about relief. And then when we've graduated, we talk about development. But we never talk about economic empowerment, which is a means of creating wealth. Now, I come from a non-prosperity gospel background. I do not believe in this health and wealth. I wanted to use a much stronger language, but given that I'm at Baylor, I better be careful here. By the way, you're going to find that I don't use a lot of Christian words. So you'll forgive me. Christianism is a very difficult language because it changes with the context where you are, and therefore meaning tends to be lost in jargon. But the problem is that often when we feel we've graduated, then we talk about development. Whereas what the world really needs today, in my experience, is empowerment at an economic level, whereby the means of creating wealth is sufficiently rolled down to the list of these, my brothers and sisters, such that they can actually become meaningful participants and not pitiful bystanders, as is the case, at least in Africa. I cannot speak of other places. Pitiful bystanders of the economic woes of their continents and countries. We have a situation in Africa where our assets are being eroded and thereby encouraging poverty of the worst kind, because we've got a country like Angola that has got tremendous amount of oil but don't have a refinery. We have a country like Liberia, which has got the largest rubber plantations, but you have to buy imported latex gloves for your operation in the hospital. and so on and so forth. And of course, we buy Michelin tires, which are produced somewhere in Canada, I believe, at almost 3 or 4 times what you pay for them in this country. And yet it is our rubber. It's the rubber from Liberia that has produced these Michelin tires. So when we talk about economic empowerment, we talk about enabling people to utilize the assets that are God-given such that they can create this sort of wealth that can promote a life of dignity. So that is the context out of which I will speak. Now, you have to forgive me if I offend you, because I'm only speaking from where I come from. And therefore, I do not know where you're coming from. And if I do say, thank God you're Christians. You have to forgive me. You are allowed to be angry with me, but as long as you don't go and sin out of your anger. But truly, it is a blessing to be part of this occasion today. You have to agree with me, sisters and brothers, that the current world status is of grave concern to the God of justice and reconciliation. And I believe that this must be fundamental, the fundamental driver for the initiative such as this one. In other words, I pray that you are moved by the things that moves the heart of God, that you're driven by those things that causes God himself to respond in anger. I think that the approach is also very, very important, because as I understand it, it takes on the idea that nothing for us or about us without us. I was listening to my brother this afternoon. I was really touched about the importance of listening when you go anywhere. I work a lot among people living with disability. That is my other life. And I've learned that it is so critical that you must never, ever do anything for anyone without them. And so when we talk about the bottom-up approach, it goes and flies against Reaganomics. I don't know if you realize that's what you're doing, where he talked about the trickle down. And of course, unfortunately, he controlled how far the trickle goes. And if you're not a favorite, the trickle didn't touch you. But anyway, bottom up goes completely and directly against what was preached as got to be known by us. Maybe never was talked about in this country as Reaganomics. So from the bottom is a notion that denotes the need for the involvement of those that we seek to help. I believe that real development takes place when there is a greater confluence of self-interests, and not simply building toilets or introducing short-term food security programs, but rather beginning to say jointly and together, how can we help? Development, on the other hand, whether it be economic or otherwise, is about the education, is about the organizing, and it is about the inculcating of discipline to people and let them determine their own future. Now, I wish I could speak also to the parallel universe almost, because I tend to want to talk about missions and how missions really runs parallel with this. They never really quite come together. And but therefore, development, it is not about going out there and building houses for people. That helps. Please don't get me wrong. I love ambulance ministries. One of the things about an ambulance ministry is that, like we used to have in some parts of South Africa, where we've got a great big iron foundry or a steel works, and Christians would be so concerned about people who are getting injured inside this factory that they would have an ambulance outside so that whoever gets injured must get help. And nobody ever stopped to say, do you guys like, or gaiuses, do you like to be injured at all? And most likely people will say no. And then you say, well, how can we stop you from being injured and not wait until you're injured and take you to hospital and look so good and kind and merciful? So really, it is therefore about educating people, whether it be about their rights, whether it be about the Constitution, whether it be about what Scripture says, but educating them. And then, of course, helping to organize them. And then from there, inculcating the sense of discipline, and then planning and all the wonderful things that we're taught in our MBA classes. But it is about this that people then can determine their own future. We are meeting at a time when there is a near meltdown of the financial systems and infrastructure. I really must say, I for the first time, felt very, very proud that our Minister of Finance in South Africa could say, we are safe. And I said, if America is having these problems, who do you think you are to say that we're safe? Well, he said, because we've taken care of the fundamentals. And I believe that this nation at this time is being called upon to face its defining moment. What is a defining moment? A defining moment is a decision. You're going to have to make that decision very shortly. Who do you vote for? Who you vote for is going to be part of the defining activity that this country is going to take. It could be a turn in the road that will determine the future. We are here talking about poverty. It's a noble thing because even the Millennium Goals of the United Nations talks about halving poverty by 2014. And so what we're doing here, we humbly submit that it is something that many people of other faiths as well and persuasions are actually working hard to do that which we believe is at the very heart of God's concern. So therefore, the context I'm speaking to is not only my own, but also a context of a globalizing world. A world that is full of contradictions, that both convicts and at the same time confuses many of us. Listen to this. I wonder if you can guess who said these words in the 50s. He says, we have 7 deadly sins in the world today, where we see wealth without work. A lot of people, whether you blame them to be the CEOs of your financial institutions, who feel that they must have wealth without work, and therefore finding ourselves trapped in the whole quagmire of entitlement. This we have seen in South Africa many times, where people said, look, I've suffered. I've been to Robben Island, my children, so therefore I deserve to get what I'm going to get. A world that is full of pleasure without conscience, which leads to a lack of accountability, where nobody feels responsible. Sometimes when you look at the effects of geopolitics around the world, it says to me, this is as a result of political leadership, whether in the north or the south, or the west or the east, that has got absolutely no sense and no conscience, but they only enjoy the pleasure of getting what they would like to and giving no account to anyone. Knowledge without character, which obscures our heroes and heroines. Commerce or business without morality, or business without ethics, which abandons values and principle in the pursuit of the bottom line. Science without humanity, that will do things that stands against and works against humanity in the name of technology. Or religion without sacrifice. Where are the great 7 leaders of today, we ask? But even more devastatingly, politics without principle, where image is more important without any regard for values and truth. Now, I'm not a political commentator, but I've done quite a bit of television work, and I've watched how the presidential elections are unfolding in this country. And and that's a very interesting thing that I've never understood, by this truthometer on CNN. I never know quite what they mean. I've tried to follow it up, but I just don't know what they mean. But I was saying to myself, I wonder how much that Obama says is driven by a sense of value, but not only value, but truth. And when good old John stands up and says Obama is a socialist, is he being honest with himself? Does he feel like he's telling the truth? Can he stand here and say, as God is my witness, I'm telling you the truth, Obama is this? Or can Obama stand up and say, as God is my witness? I know some people think that he should say Allah, but anyway, as God is my witness, what I'm saying is the truth. Politics without principle. It's a very interesting thing. Well, if you don't know who said those things, it was Gandhi in the 1950s. And so, therefore, the larger context that I'm going to talk to is not just in terms of my own personal experience, but also the context of a globalizing world. because globalization is about the economic and social, maybe you may even want spiritual principles, whereby local markets and cultures and values are increasingly dominated by global markets, as well as cultural and socio-economic and political trends. I was asked once by my son to buy him a pair of shoes. Well, I think you call them sneakers or something like this. So I went to the Foot Locker, yes, and I thought I was a pretty clued up father. You know, I could go to the Foot Locker and buy these shoes for my son. And when I got there, and I asked the lady, and of course the price was a bit unreasonable, but she said, "Sir, those shoes are not yet issued. They are coming up next week." Now, my son, in the context of South Africa, could already know a pair of shoes that's going to be issued before they were, and instruct me as a father who knew very little to bring them. And so when we talk about globalization, we're talking about the possibility of people's self-understanding being impacted by things that are happening tens of thousands of miles away. And lo and behold, if you're a father like me and you don't know what's happened because you don't look at the internet sufficiently, you'll always be asked to buy sneakers which have not yet been issued. So what is our challenge then in the context of this globalization or globalizing world? Our challenge is to affirm our diversity. I wish I had time to unpack that. Our challenge is to affirm our diversity such that it enriches our understanding of the world. Now, this is a very difficult thing for most of us to do. I can only understand America from the context of my place in Soweto, and I can almost tell you that 99% of the time is distorted. It is not correct. And therefore, my challenge is to begin to understand this globalization possibility and begin to see what it is that I ought to affirm within the American context, such that I can understand the world better. But I think more importantly for our purposes tonight is to inform our vision of and for the world. If I was to ask you tonight, what is actually happening in the world? Can you tell me, what is your vision? What is your view? What do you see? Do you have an understanding of what the world is all about? What informs that knowledge that you have? What newspaper article? What television channel? I was quite astounded that you actually have two versions of CNN in the world. I always thought there's only one CNN. Then I realized, no, there's a CNN for Americans, and there's a CNN for the rest of us. And I was taken aback. But which CNN tells you what is happening in the world? Which CNN tells you what's happening in Iraq? And so, what is your understanding of what is going on in the world? But even more critically, what is your vision for the world? If God was to become a significant partner, now please watch my language, a significant partner in your vision of the world, would God agree with you that this is what He wants for the world? And so this is a tremendous challenge for us to say, well, what is our vision of the world? How do I get to know what is going on in the world? I like this. I studied in America, by the way, so some of these things used to fascinate me when you used to have the World Series. I think they're about to start. But the World Series is only about American baseball teams. So why do you call it the World Series? It baffles me. But anyway, maybe because the definition of the world ends on the Atlantic shores or on the Pacific. Anyway, but this is a very, very, very serious challenge for us to actually begin to understand the world and become partners together with God in His redemptive purpose on the basis of a vision that is driven by the reality of what moves God's heart. Okay, so that's a little bit about the context. I want to just go very briefly on the whole issue of enterprise, because you cannot speak of entrepreneurs without understanding the word enterprise. And I've dared to say that enterprise is both a mindset and a skill set, which involves spotting opportunities and turning ideas into reality. It's a very homespun definition of enterprise. It's both a mindset and a skill set which involves spotting opportunities. Simply saying, you've got a need, I've got the ability, I'm in business. That's Economics 101 for those of you who. But the enterprising person is highly motivated, awake to opportunity, able to be resourceful and employ creativity and innovation in solving problems. Such a person is able to make decisions in the face of uncertainty and is able to motivate others and able to work within the context of a team. Entrepreneurship, on the other hand, is a process whereby enterprise is employed or pursued and leads to the pursuit of opportunity through new ventures. That's entrepreneurship. Now, the inclusion of the word social before entrepreneurship simply denotes that it is an entrepreneur who works for the common good. Now, if we had time, we would like to unpack that as well. Because when we begin to talk about the common good, what are the biblical ideas and notions that deals with us? The fact that it reigns over the good and the bad, the righteous and the evil. So an entrepreneur is one who works for the common good. And that is why you can be an entrepreneur within a Muslim context, a Jewish context, and even a Christian context. Because you are driven by the idea of the common good. Now, when George W. Bush came up with a faith-based fund that he runs, the whole idea that he was trying to promote, and I supported this, was the idea that we will then, the one thing that will define who we give the money to is if they're committed to the common good. Right? So that becomes what we call social entrepreneurship. It begins to catapult you into activity that drives you to seek those biblical concepts to be put within the context of public policy without saying, thus says the Lord. Because a lot of us, if it is not a Christian radio station, it's not Christian. We don't accept the fact that you can have a radio station run by Christians. And it's a completely different idea. And your orientation is different because you look at competition differently if you do it that way. Whereas if you're a Christian station, who do you compete with? Compete with those who are not in Christian radio. But if you have to live within the context of the secular world, then your radio station becomes a whole lot more of a viable proposition than if you were to live from the donations of good folks in the Baptist church. Entrepreneurs are not necessarily poor people. I used to think that you have to be poor. No. And I've learned that a good entrepreneur does well while they do good. Somebody said to me, no, Caesar, you are useless to poor people if you're poor yourself. So please, if you want to work with poor people, get some money in your bank account. Get some skills. Then you can be of some use to poor people. I remember my brother was the first MBA student out of Wits University in Johannesburg. And his first client was an old man who used to sell coal with a truck. And so he was trying to teach him how to buy a truck by using the bank's money. And this old man just did not understand this because the way he bought trucks was he saved enough money under the mattress. When he had enough money, puts it in a plastic bag and goes and buys a truck. So my brother was really waxing lyric about how wonderful it is to use the financial institutions. And the old man stopped and says, listen, have you ever counted 200,000 rand? Because my brother had never done that before. And he says, well, you see, you cannot teach me a whole lot about how to buy trucks. Goodbye. And that was the end of it. By the way, the end of the story is that old man lost his trucks and he had no recourse because he did not use the bank money. And I know there are microfinance people in here. I'd like to hopefully interact with you. So a social entrepreneur seeks the transformation of persons and their communities to achieve the redemptive purpose of our Creator God. I always say the same thing about transformation in terms of the preaching of the gospel. That the gospel is not about the individual. Yes, it starts with the individual, but never ends with the individual. It is always to transform persons and their communities. Now, therefore, you can ask me some very difficult questions which I will not be able to answer. Because at one time, Africa had the fastest growing church in the world. But we were also fastest growing in terms of HIV/AIDS pandemic. We're the fastest in terms of impoverishing our communities. 4 of the poorest countries in the world are in Africa. And of those 4, 3 of them have got the greatest amount of diamonds and oil and everything else that comes in between. So what is this Christian thing you're talking to me about? Oops. You see, I told you I'll say things which I probably shouldn't say. But thank God there's a pulpit here. If you throw anything, I'll duck under the pulpit. But let's turn our mind a little bit to the issue of poverty, because this is more difficult to define. I remember when we went to the Lesotho Highlands some years ago, all armed up with all the latest ways of helping people to come out of poverty. And we reached this very proud Mosotho man in his blanket and his hat and up in the mountains. And I began to tell him how poor he was. And he says, my goodness, you know, I never knew that I'm poor until you told me. He said, I've got my wife, I've got my kids, just because I don't have a toilet inside, which I don't want anyway, inside my house, you say I'm poor. It made me think, what actually does it mean? How do you define poverty? And therefore, poverty in its very essence is a deprivation of common necessities that determine the quality of life. And those would include, of course, food, it would include clothing, it will include shelter. From our part of the world, and if you worked in the Sahel, like my brother Norman, it would include safe drinking water. It will include opportunity to learn. In urban areas, it includes the opportunity to obtain employment. And of course, poverty means the inability to create wealth by accessing equity. I know some of these are concepts, economic concepts, that we don't have time to really deal with. And since I was told that I must speak quickly and sit down before you fell asleep, I will not say too much about that. But the whole issue of equity, I love the country of Zambia. And I had to advise them, don't give foreigners title deeds to your land. And of course, I'm a foreigner in Zambia. So they said, do you understand what you're saying? I said, I probably don't, but I'm saying it because of the commitment that I've got. Because they've got very few islands on the Zambezi River next to Victoria Falls. And I can go and buy it. Actually, there's somebody who works in Guinea-Bissau here. You can buy islands off of Guinea-Bissau for $5,000, and you can own it and your children's children forever and ever and ever. And no matter what happens there, unless there's a coup or there's a war, those people in Guinea-Bissau will not be able to fish off of your island, which is their livelihood. So there is something about equity, about holding the rights, not as the socialists would say to the means of production, but to the source that enables you to create wealth for yourself. All right, so how do we best characterize social entrepreneurs? An entrepreneur is a leader. And I'll emphasize this, and I'm going to emphasize quite a bit with a few words a little bit later. It's a leader who understands power. Now, I know, of course, I was brought up with the English literature that power corrupts, isn't it? And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then we sing in our churches, we serve a powerful God. And I say, oh, is God corrupt or what's going on here? But anyway, a leader who understands power and uses it wisely to translate intentions or goals into reality and sustain them while at the same time communicating vision, influencing followers, pointing the direction. And I love this last one, generating enthusiasm and commitment. I remember the few times I've had an opportunity with my president in South Africa. I said, sir, I don't pay you, because see how arrogant we can get sometimes in South Africa. I don't pay you to come and tell me how to get rid of HIV and AIDS. You can leave that to the scientists. I pay you to lift a vision before me that tells me where you're taking us. And I'd like to ask our world leader the same question. I'd like to ask Ban Ki-moon. He says, Chief, just tell me something. What is your, where would you like to take the world? Show me. Can I ask you a question? When last did you redefine the American dream of where it's taken this country? What you would like it to become? Is it something that people should give their life for? Would you be proud to ask people to die for what you would consider to be the vision out of which has sprung the American dream? What about this power? You've got an enormous amount of power in this country. How is that being used to translate the intentions or the goals into reality? And so on and so forth. Okay, that's enough about that. Entrepreneurs believe that you must become the change that you want to see in the world. Now, I'd like to highlight 5 traits that spells out the nature of entrepreneurs. Number 1, entrepreneurs by their very nature are change-friendly. They're not afraid to change. They embrace the idea that the situation around them is not right, or as we say in South Africa, is not correct, and needs to be changed. But more than that, they see themselves as the agent that should bring about that change. You want to do good in the world. Get people to be committed to the notion that once I know something has to change, I don't ask you as an American missionary or a businessman to actually bring about that change, but I see it as my responsibility to bring about that change. I can tell you that there are very few missiological classes that teaches that. And so entrepreneurs play a role of transformers. Secondly, entrepreneurs are opportunity orientated. I don't know how you say it in America, whether they say orientated or oriented. I'm so glad English is my third language, so I can actually create words myself, because I'm not responsible for the dictionary meaning of these words. Entrepreneurs are those who always have the presence of mind to see an opportunity in any situation, particularly in crisis. Some of you might have heard sermons about this word crisis in Chinese, that it's a cross, all those nice things we say, or krinai in Greek, which means a sifting, and so on. But they see an opportunity, particularly in crisis. There is no midnight hour that does not present the potential of a dawn. I used to preach a sermon before 1994 in South Africa. When people said, "Watchman, how far gone is the night?" I would say, "Morning cometh." I wouldn't say it's night. I'd say the morning comes, but so also the night. Because it's 5 minutes past midnight for many places in the world. But 5 minutes past midnight is 5 minutes into a new day. And therefore, with anticipation of the healing of God that comes in the morning, the tender mercies that are revealed to me in the morning. And do you understand what that means? It means that he who guides me during the day, I'm able to thank him when it's daylight. The difficulty, and I'm sorry to preach a little bit, sir, but I used to say this to my congregations, is the problem why Christians are unthankful enough. We have lost sometimes in our congregations the ability to praise God regardless. It's because we don't know what God has protected us from. You see. Unless God takes you through a very difficult time, and then you are able to look back and say, I could have gone through that ravine. I could have fallen down that mountainside. But God actually carried me through when I was not even aware that I was in danger. So we usually don't know what God has actually protected us from. And that is why the Bible says, in everything, give thanks. For this is the will of God concerning you in Christ Jesus. In everything, give thanks. That's why we're able to say, I'm sorry to preach again, we know that all things work together for good. All things. Well, the only way that you are able to appreciate that is to see those people who've been taken through the night. And they were able to recognize that night at the break of day, and they are able to be thankful to God. Anyway, that's for Sunday morning in a good church. There is no cloud that will not have a silver lining. For them, any impediment or perceived failure is an opportunity to learn, to become wiser, for future reference, and for sound decision making. Thirdly, entrepreneurs are innovative. And I won't take time on this one. It is often said that one must think outside the box. I don't know if you understand that our education, when I first went to school, I was given a crayon and a coloring book. And the first thing that you see when you look at the coloring book are lines, and you're told to stay within the line. Then you'll have done a good job. So all of my life, formative time, I was being told to stay within the lines. Well, in recent times, however, wisdom has dictated, especially for those of us from the Southern African context, that we must not only think outside the box, must throw away the box. Because the problem with that box is somebody else has created that box, and they created it with you in mind. They want to make sure that you stay within those lines, and if you did, the world will be very, very orderly. So throw away the box. Stop trying to shift your paradigms. Let your paradigms run after you and try and catch up with you. Because when you do that, you will know that mistakes are made by those who are trying to do something, more than those who sit in their false sense of security and comfort zones by only implementing solutions which are supposedly tried and tested. Unfortunately, tried and tested in laboratories got nothing to do with most of the contexts where you're trying to bring that solution. Fourthly, they are resourceful. They see resources and they find a way to mobilize or move them to areas of higher productivity and higher yield. Fifthly, they are value creators. For the entrepreneur, value is not understood in a one-dimensional image whereby wealth is defined as the pursuit of material goods, which has resulted in conspicuous consumerism that goes against the biblical teaching that, as it was quoted by the interim president, that you fool, you are not the sum total of your possessions. You are not the sum total of what you have. My father used to say to me, he said, son, when you're not able to give a shirt away, it means that you no longer own the shirt, but the shirt owns you. Because you are not what you have. It speaks of value as the restoring of shalom in individuals and communities that is characterized by uninjuredness, by hopefulness, by justice, by righteousness. Social entrepreneurship creates the space within which affirmed and empowered individuals, given the opportunity to pursue their purpose in life, stay rooted in that wholeness. As I've said, that good entrepreneurs are those who intentionally pursue the public good. I hope you are seeing how this can help us with poverty. They act as change agents in the social sector by adopting a mission to create and sustain social value, relentlessly pursue opportunity to serve their mission. They are focused, continuously innovating, adapting, and learning, acting boldly without being limited by resources currently in hand. A little bit of faith. You can see, I'm not quoting the text, but I hope you can see the relevance of what the Bible teaches here. Exhibiting a heightened sense of accountability to the constituencies served and for the outcomes created. What should drive social entrepreneurs? Very quickly, another 5 sets. You see, I'm sorry, to that extent, I'm not very Baptistic. I should be having 3 points, but I've got 5 so far. And this is the second time, so please forgive us our tardiness there. But what should drive us as entrepreneurs? The first thing is the redemptive purpose of God. Once I understand what it is that God is seeking to do in his created order, I then simply walk alongside that. It becomes a faith walk, because he who has created that which he seeks to redeem, or to use a more stronger language, that which he seeks to salvage, I will feel strengthened in my belief and in my faith. The redemptive purpose of God is about restoring justice. Now, and again, this is a very, very important thing if you're going to dealing with poverty. A lot of the poverty in the world today is because of injustice. A lot of our poverty is planned poverty. The G8 can tell you now how much the GDP of Africa is going to grow, or is going to be allowed to grow. They actually said it in Latin America a few years ago. It says, well, for Southern Africa, so much must be the case. And Central Africa this, and it's amazing. And it all went past us until it was too late. So the redemptive purpose of God is a key driver for an entrepreneur. Now, even as a pastor, because a pastor by his very nature can be an entrepreneur, when you encounter difficulties and problems in other people's lives, what you seek to find is what is God's purpose in us confronting this situation, which is an affront to God. And when you know that he wants to redeem, you begin to look at issues of justice around the poverty. In South Africa, we talk about planned poverty, you see. And maybe we have time sometime when we have a seminar more than a presentation. The second thing that should drive us is relationships. Now, I cannot, our work among the disabled people, which stretches from Zambia right down to the tip of Southern Africa, is utongati, which is a Zulu word which says, you're something because of us. I am something because you are. And therefore, relationships are critical. There are times when, at the darkest times within apartheid, where one felt like denouncing your brothers. But because he's your brother or he's your sister, you found it possible to come alongside them, find a way to seek to change their mind. And where you couldn't, never to participate in their demise. In other words, you even allowed them to make their mistakes. And my father used to say to me, and you find me saying a lot about what my father said, at the end of his life, he asked us to change his name because when he became a Christian, his life was so radicalized that we had to change his name. And he began to say things out of his experience. And one of the things that he used to say is, son, you must never, never, ever stop your children from making mistakes. They must make their mistakes. The only thing is, don't let them think that they don't have to pay for their mistakes. Even if you help them, they must ask you for the help to pay for their mistakes. Relationships. We have a phrase in South Africa that I've got several white brothers. And I remember, these people would be surprised because we'd appear with these white people at places that and I would say, no, this is my brother from another mother. And that settled it for us. So you will find us whenever I talk. I was talking to somebody like that this morning, and I called my brother from another mother, and I was explaining to you how that came about. But these are brothers. There's a relationship there that I could not deny because I've realized that that relationship is dictated to by who God is to me and to that person. The third thing that should drive us is experience or understanding of history. The third thing that should drive us is leadership. They are driven, these entrepreneurs, but what drives managers? Now listen to this. An entrepreneur as a leader not only seeks to administrate, but he seeks to innovate. Not only does he seek to imitate, as a good manager must imitate, but a good leader, entrepreneur, originates. He does not just imitate. He doesn't just maintain, but he develops. He doesn't just focus on systems, but he focuses on people. He doesn't rely on control, but he inspires trust. He doesn't get bogged down by short-range view, but rather inspired by the long term, settling for the long haul. He doesn't ask how and when. Usually an entrepreneur knows what they don't know. Because when you don't know what you don't know, you at least know where to go to get that which you don't know done by those who know something about what you don't know. So they don't ask how and when, but they ask what and why. They don't have their eyes on the bottom line, which is a problem for someone like me. I remember saying to my wife when I was 49, now that was 10 years ago, I said, honey, at 55 I want to be a donor. She said, sure. At 55 you'll be donating your kidneys and your lungs because you'll be dead the way you're going on. But because I never looked at the bottom line. She says, you'll be bankrupt, busted and broken and downtrodden. But I didn't look at the bottom line because I said, somebody else should look after that. But they challenge the status quo. They don't do things right, they do the right thing. They don't have subordinates, they have followers. And they don't focus on their own turf, but focus on the bigger picture. They're driven by opportunity that is presented. Sometimes we do this too much to our children. We present too many opportunities to them. And when they are confused with those opportunities and they choose not to choose, we're taking away from them the possibility of becoming responsible for their future. Because when they choose not to choose, somebody else chooses for them. So to choose not to choose is a choice. But the fact that you're choosing somebody else to determine what you're going to become. So sometimes the opportunity is presented, but sometimes, like God, as we say when I was taught in Bible college, ex nihilo nihilo fit. Out of nothing, nothing is created. A real entrepreneur will come into a situation. I remember my mother. I don't know how that woman had food for us by the Thursday of every week. Because Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we could survive with what my father scraped together over the weekend. But by Wednesday, I can assure you all the money was gone. But we ate on Thursday. We ate on Friday. She created food out of nothing. That's an entrepreneur. Now, let me conclude with an ancient story. Just in case you think, Sister does not even believe in the Bible. Let me share with you very, very briefly a very ancient story. The story of Joseph. You know that Joseph was the first guy who introduced the idea of food banks, right? I mean, you know that. When everybody else says to me, Sister, the Bible is not an economic book, I say, sure, but man, it's full of economic ideas. But Joseph actually created the first food bank and did it so well that I wish we could learn of it. If Africa could learn something from Joseph, Africa could take care of his own. So right now, Africa eats her own. And unfortunately, she calls the enemy to sit with her around the table. Right now, China is schlepping every barrel of oil out of southern Sudan. By the time the Sudanese have set up the oil wells, every single one of that oil barrel will be gone, sold. The French, I hope nobody's French here. I used to buy French mahogany until I found that it's from Cameroon. Where's my brother from Cameroon? And they take it out of Cameroon, take it to Tunisia, and beneficiate it, and I buy it as French mahogany. And that's sad. But Joseph was an entrepreneur of the first kind. 3 words. That's my Baptist coming out. Joseph, in Genesis chapter 41, had an incredible sense of history. When he's called before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tries to get him to pontificate, Joseph remembers where he came from. And what did he say to Pharaoh? And Pharaoh knew that this man had interpreted dreams which had come true, had given consultancies without consulting fees in prison, and that his predictions were right. And Pharaoh called him. Now, Pharaoh knew that he could. And what does he say? Remembering the utter need for dependence upon God. He says to Pharaoh, Pharaoh, I cannot tell you what your dream means. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Now, folks, I can spend 2 hours on this. The world comes to you and say, listen, we need American wisdom. I cannot do it. But I'm going to pray that God gives you the answer. So he remembers. And so from understanding what happened when he was thrown into the pit, when he was being abandoned by his own kith and kin, he remembered that it is not by might, nor by power, but by his spirit. And as an entrepreneur, sometimes when we face the situation of abject power, I'm tempted to change the message. When you suddenly find yourself in the White House and you face the crisis of speaking the truth, the possibility is you'll change the message to suit the situation. Well, friends, remember, when you change your message in a crisis, when the crisis is over, you have no message. Remember that. And so Joseph, even though he could have taken the glory and said, God speaks to me. These new preachers today stand up and says, God said to me. Says, oh yeah. I remember my theology teacher, he came in first day. He says, by the way, you born again, you believe you know God, huh? So of course we know God. He says, could you tell me who's God? And I realized the need to be humble. That to even dare say, I know God, is far more arrogant than saying, I am known by God. And so Joseph did not take the glory because he remembered the history of how God had spared him. He remembered the times when he could have been killed instantly and he was spared. So he said, listen, whatever I do is because of him and him alone. Can we ask the same question about poverty? Because if God, okay, after you've discounted the story, the line from Jesus that said the poor shall have all the time, even though we could go into that text and really begin to try and understand what he meant. But after you've discounted this, all right, out of the 1 billion, 1.2 billion people who live on less than $2 a day right now, supposing you say the poor shall, so let's take 200 million aside, okay? So these we shall have all the time because they're lazy, they don't want to be organized, they don't want to be educated, they are refusing to be helped. So they will always be with us. So toss a few coins to them from time to time. But what about the billion? And so if God is all-knowing, is omniscient, is all of these wonderful things that we preach about on Sunday mornings, if God is that, how come we cannot even begin to put a dent, even when the people who are poor are sitting on a pile of cash called diamonds or oil or manganese or coal or gold or whatever the case might be? How come God is not able to? And so I cannot do it. So therefore we become dependent on God. He says, Lord, what would you have us do? The men of Issachar who understood the times, that they understood and they knew what Israel should do. So he had tremendous hindsight. But secondly, he had an amazing insight. Because he could look at what was happening. He saw the greed of Wall Street. He saw the political corruption of some of the African states. He saw the deception. I don't know if you know, in South Africa we used to say, and I know this is not true, but we used to say it anyway. Who said we should always say what is true? We can even say things. But I remember them saying, you know, an Afrikaner, that Africans were very honest. They will tell you, we don't like you, you are a third-class citizen. The British, they really will tell you how to go to hell in such a way that you gave them thanks for the directions. But Joseph understood the greed, but he also understood the desire for salvation. And he was able to work with it. He says, King, you know what it means that you've got 7 fat cows which are swallowed by these lean ones. What are the lean ones? It's the greed that drove Egypt. My people perished because of what? Of lack of knowledge, because of ignorance. They did not understand simple cycles. In Africa, we've got this problem. I mean, if you go to Kenya, and some of you I know go to Kenya quite a lot, and I remember when they used to have these power cuts, and I said, what's the matter with us? How can, and they said, well, because we got a drought. I said, but don't you know that every 3 to 4 years there's a drought? Of course we do. So how come you didn't build the dams? So when there is a drought, you've got electricity. Why can't you learn from the Germans, who have got a flood that comes once every 150 years, but the locks on the river exists now? Ignorance, lack of knowledge. In Mozambique, those of you who know Southern Africa, there are floods every year. And one time, us as South African nation were so proud that we were able to pluck a newborn baby from the top of a tree. Some of you might have seen that. And we gave a lot of accolades to the soldiers who did this. But the truth of the matter is that those floods are still happening now. Why? Because where those floods actually happens, it never rains. It rains up in the highlands between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And so the poor Mozambicans will be sitting there, and suddenly there is this incredible wash of water that destroys hundreds of them every year. So those people don't know. Now we know, the government knows. So Joseph had such an insight of how to use the knowledge that existed to actually transform the self-understanding of the Egyptians. But the last one I want to say is that he had incredible foresight. Now, if you do strategic work, we always tell you that you always start with the end in mind. That's a Covey thing. Now, even if Covey said it, we used to practice quite a bit in South Africa, at least in Africa, that you start with the future in mind. What is it that is driving you? So Joseph looked, he says, I need to be restored to my people, so I'm going to do this thing because that's the future that I want. I want to see Africa free from all forms of slavery. I want to see the Thai young girls and Indian young women who are sold into sex slavery freed. That's the future. And therefore, Joseph began to sit down and says, what is the foresight that we need? And may God help us that there is a future that you're living for. And it could be it could be heaven, that's fine. I never deny Christians of that joy, except that please remember that heaven is a third-class waiting room in the railroad of God in terms of what God intends. Because remember, he's going to destroy the heaven and the earth, right? And bring it right down here. So when you go to heaven, that's fine. But it would be wonderful if you had a future vision for the world. What is it? Because that's what's going to drive you to say, here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Or Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. If you've got something to die for, you have something to live for. God bless you.
Friends and colleagues, we have just a few minutes before the end of our scheduled time, and Caesar has agreed graciously to take questions. And let me invite those of you who would so like to pose a question to make your way to the front of the room, to the open mic here. Let me insist, in fact, that you do that. I've been in enough settings here to know that no matter how loudly you think you speak, you will not be heard across this vast expanse of a room. The sound really does die. And if there are a few that line up, that's quite all right.
So this is really a top-down question, not a bottom-up question, but I'm curious. It's been said that if the United States and Europe would quit subsidizing so much their farm industry, so that developing countries, including Africa, could be able to compete in that agricultural market, that would actually be more beneficial than most of the foreign aid that we give. And I'm wondering what your sense of that is, because that's a foreign policy issue that I think is hard to address because there's too many vested interests here.
Yes.
But it makes me sad to think if that's so, then we should somehow figure out a way to get the farmers to let go, so to speak.
Okay, I don't know, maybe we should get another question, then I'll try and do both. Let me just test how much of the cells have gone out of my brain. Yes, boss.
I was going to ask you about what you said about the different things happening in Africa. You cited a number of examples in West Africa and in South Africa. And the floods in Mozambique caught my attention. And it seems to me that is emblematic of the African problem. Few things happen in Africa in which all of Africa somehow doesn't play a part.
Yeah.
What do you know that is happening in Africa right now that gives us hope that all of Africa can come to the rescue of those people in Mozambique?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with this. You know, I remember in the, I know this just tells you how young or how not young I am, but I remember when John Gattu called for the moratorium on missions. He says, missionaries go home. And you know, a lot of us would say, this is very unkind, John Gattu was a Presbyterian preacher out of Tanzania. And I think one of the things about Africa today is that there are enough of us in Africa to actually get to a point where we say we don't want to sell our food to Europe and to America, or to anyone for that matter, until we've fed all of our people. The biggest problem for Africa today in that regard is not so much the subsidies, so we can access the markets, is what the IMF and the World Bank has done in forcing people to go to cash crops that can be sold. I mean, you go to Mozambique, they produce macadamia nuts like you don't want to know. But a short 30 years ago, no Mozambican knew what a macadamia nut was. But it was a cash crop to what? To pay their loan. And that's a problem. So I want to start there to say that I think this is where we need to become quite. By the way, one of the things that I did not do tonight is to tell you what I do in terms of entrepreneurial development. That's really a topic for a seminar or a workshop where we can do some drawings on the board. But in my work to try and stimulate the entrepreneurial spirit, I found that we need to help our people to focus first and foremost in those things local that can develop a sense of dignity and self-worth and the value of the people. And therefore, what we would then ask for the big powers is to do two things. One is to assist us, not necessarily to say we must not pay for the sins of our forefathers who bought arms by actually mortgaging our resources in our lands, but that the repayments must be such that they don't destroy the ability of, and the creativity of the local people to produce sufficiently for their own tables. So that's the first thing. Having said that, obviously, I mean, right now, when we talk about innovation, we've got a system, and I know that here in the South you'll understand this more than anywhere else. We've got a system that can produce 5 to 8 tons of catfish a month. It's a production system, and obviously, like the greatest buyers of this is Japanese. So at the same time, we want to say that let us mitigate this situation. I used to believe that we must stop the globalization until I learned that, you know, it's like trying to stop the waves of the ocean. And you end up as a little pebble on the beach because it will get pulverized against other rocks. But the best thing to do is to actually build a channel and channel that water to a hydroelectric system that can produce electricity. So therefore, you don't fight change, you use it creatively. And if you are full of grace, and God has been wonderful and gracious to you, should be able to find ways to do this. So that even the evil, when the Bible says the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our God, what it means is that through the power and the insight of the Holy Spirit, you'll be able to actually take those things, and I'm going to use the word because it's not there in English, and facipulate them into the common good that it was never intended by those who actually came up with the policies. So yes, that's true. Obviously, the subsidies, we believe now, again, we don't have the sophistication of knowledge. We believe that it is building a false sense of security, because when you're not able to compete truly in the world market and you distort the market for purpose of your own sense of economic well-being, then when that is yanked away from you, either by war or by suddenly not having access to Iraqi oil, and I look at America and I envy you for the kind of price you're paying for petrol. I wish I could pay that. You go to Zambia, they're paying 25 to 27 rand a liter. Now, there are 5 liters to a gallon. And therefore, you can imagine for people in Zambia, whose kwacha is worth what? About 6,000 kwacha to $1. And what does a school teacher get a month? A school teacher gets about 30,000 kwacha a month. So that you can see that we're used to paying these things. Now, the day comes when you are not able to feed the petrol thirst of your economy with cheap oil, you're going to be dead in the water. And you've come very, very close to that. By the way in which, and by the way, I'm not a housing guru, but the way in which you made people have houses in America almost did you down. So that's a false sense of security. And therefore, you need to go back to the real. So the subsidies for us is artificially propping up a situation that makes you to look competitive, when in actual fact you wouldn't be if the chips are down. Now, the other issue, and I'm glad you asked that question, is I hope when I talked about 5 minutes past midnight, I was also indicating to you that I'm a hopeless optimist. And when you look at Africa, because of that, of seeking and looking for, there are islands of incredible, I mean, even within Zimbabwe, where the inflation is over 11 million%. I mean, I know you cannot even conceive of what that means, except that if you can imagine a shop that is about 4 times the size of a football ground, and there are only 2 things available, and out of 18 tills, only 1 is working, because they are selling only 2 items, which are finished within an hour of the shop opening up. And then after that, there is nothing. Now, when I say nothing, I don't mean that you could go to the next shop and get it, or go to the next town and get it, or to the next county or get it, or go to the next state. No, there is nothing. You cannot buy, even if you have a trillion, or as they say in Zimbabwe, a quadrillion Zim dollars. You cannot buy. It's not there. That's what 11 million% inflation actually means. So, but even within that context, we have found the resourcefulness and the resilience of the Zimbabwean people that has caused that country not to collapse into utter darkness, because there is that resilience. On a democratic front, there are now more presidents in Africa who are ex-presidents than it has ever been before. Never have we had so. I mean, when the president of Botswana is changed, you don't even see it in the papers. That's how much of a routine thing within Botswana. We just got rid of our president. And we just said, fellow, actually, please, on Monday, just take your stuff out of the office. And oh, by the way, all the gifts that you did get, if they are not declared, you also leave them there. And then those that you've declared will decide how much of them you must take for yourself. We just did that. We have a possibility of another party in South Africa, and everybody says, oh, we're going into total chaos. No. What we're doing is that we're just going to cut down the power of the ANC, and I'm an ANC member. In South Africa, the ANC is a religion. That's part of the problem. People cannot move away from it. But now we've got the possibility of actually having the 2/3 majority of the ANC cut down to about 51%. It's happening. And there are no tanks on the streets yet. There are no political prisoners yet in South Africa. And it's because the democracy there is holding. We've got a press that is embarrassingly robust. I mean, sometimes I wish people didn't say the things they're saying, but the press is there. So there is hope. The second thing is, I believe that with the progression of missiological paradigms shifting from Southern California, and I know that those of you who are missiologists may understand this. In other words, the notions of church growth as a la Peter Wagner and others, that notion is actually becoming outdated and jaded. And people are beginning to say, wait a minute, it is not about numbers when we talk about church growth. Yes, it is. It's very, for me as a pastor, it's very important. You got to get those lost sheep, those goats being converted into sheep all the time. But at the end of the day, God never leaves himself without a remnant and a witness. Therefore, growth of the church has got nothing to do ultimately with the numbers. Numbers indicate that there is movement, but the church may not be growing, might just be getting fat instead of growing. And we need to be careful of that. So, because of the shift of the missiological paradigms from Southern California to other places, hopefully it's happening here at Baylor as well, there is a chance now of sufficient and significant dialogue that people such as myself, and I believe I'm at the end of that, there are hundreds of others who are emerging behind us, who are beginning to see Africa and Africa's plight in the same way as being dealt with entrepreneurially. Let me say this also, which may not please you, is that the NGO mentality, I'm almost afraid to say this, but the NGO, the ministry of helps, is a wonderful thing, but it never, ever brings transformation. It doesn't get to the core and to the root of evil within systems such that it can actually expose them to the light to kill the bacteria, as it were. So there is a growing realization of this. So therefore, we move from helps and relief to development. If you've been with World Vision, you'll know that transition. We've moved in South Africa from training people in skills, but moved to the market facilitation, where you created the pull effect so that people, I mean, the best passion fruit in the world is in Uganda. But Ugandans don't have passion fruit juice. So we say to them, give me your passion fruit and let's make juice in Uganda. And people said, but you must go and teach people how to plant passion fruit. I said, no, these people have been planting passion fruit for thousands of years. They know what is a good passion fruit and what is a bad one. What they've never known is how to commercialize the good passion fruit. So tell them, you give me good passion fruit, I give you ndaramba, give you good money. Once you've done that, the market does what it does best. So there is this kind of a change. There is a blatant attempt now, if you go to the DRC, because South Africa, if you look at their mining policy and the legislation, key to their legislation is beneficiation. So I don't want to sell you tomatoes, I want to sell you ketchup. I don't want to sell you rubber, I want to sell you tires. You know that in the future, catalytic converters are going to be dependent on platinum. Now, where is platinum? Africa is floating. Zimbabwe is floating on platinum. And I'm saying to Zimbabweans, don't sell ore. Sell catalytic converters. And any country that wants to do business with you, welcome them with open arms. Don't give them a title deed to the land. Give them a right to mine. But you hold the right to beneficiate. That mindset is growing, and it is a really wonderful thing. The other thing that, maybe just to jump a little bit, I saw you've got your financial center downstairs. One of the things happening in Africa now is stock exchanges. I mean, there's a brilliant stock exchange in Kenya, brilliant stock exchange in Ghana. Even Zimbabwe has got a stock exchange. South Africa has got a very good securities exchange. And what is beginning to happen now is I can now buy stocks in Kenya as South African with my rand. I don't have to have euros or pounds or dollars. I can do it through my currency. When that begins to happen, I'm sure those of you who are in economic development, you know what that means, because then you pull the value chain back into your community, which is really what entrepreneurs do, by the way. All what they do is they pull the value chain back to the original source and let ownership spread through equity through the value chain. Okay. Now, I know that doesn't sound very Christianese, but I hope you see what I'm beginning to say. The issue when George Kinoti, you can Google him, George Kinoti was the professor of biology at the University of Kenya. When he began talking like I'm talking now 20 years ago, nobody was prepared. When Lamin Sane, I know one of you was saying he's a friend of yours, Lamin Sane out of the Gambia, when he began to talk like this, when the young man, well, he's actually passed on now, from Ghana, began to speak like this. 20 years ago, nobody wanted to listen. Now, there are institutes that are springing all over the place, trying to deal with these very vexing issues. So that has given me a lot of hope. Cameroon was an example I've given, because we did try to do timber work in Cameroon and tried to bring in environmental responsibility into Cameroon. We didn't win because of the corruption, as you probably know. But we don't give up. Now we're going to the DRC, we're going to go to Congo, Brazzaville, we're going to go to Gabon. Gabon has had a leader for 40 years and he's got no intention to leave and so on and so forth. But we're beginning to do that, and so there is hope for us. Let me just switch off to for me, and this has got nothing to do with entrepreneurship, but this is got a concern that we have about the transplant of American consumerist theology that basically says if you buy a Gucci suit, leave the label on the outside so people can see that this is an Armani or this is a Gucci. And this is a phenomenon that we really feel is injurious. Part of it is because in the past, it was the best Americans who went out as missionaries. It was the best British young men and women who went out as missionaries. No, not anymore. You don't export your best. And that is a problem. You've gone the way of the material. Because you don't, when I grew up, we never bought the best clothes. What we used to think were best clothes were what was rejected by C.S. Roebuck in South Africa. And of course, I only realized when I came to America, my goodness, I was buying the C.S. Roebuck rejects, and I thought, gee, I look like an American. And we used to put a pebble in our mouth so we can speak more like an American and roll your R's and so on and so forth. But anyway, I talk too much, I'm sorry.